an extraordinary ability for one who perhaps had a background that was much more difficult than we realised. So therefore, the ability to always see positive and move forward must have been built into his psyche. It must have been an incredible challenge to have to deal with.
An extraordinary ability for one who perhaps had a background that was much more difficult than we realize. So therefore, the ability to always see positive and move forward must have been built into his psyche, which must have been an incredible challenge to have to deal with. Just minutes ago, the royal world changed with one sentence that carried the weight of years. Princess and rejected Meghan's final plea, and the palace confirmed the door was closed. Not delayed, not reconsidered, but closed. Behind that decision was a private moment so sharp and so final that even seasoned courtiers understood this was no ordinary refusal. This was the definitive end of a long, painful chapter. Meghan had sent what those inside the palace called her final private plea. It was not a public speech. It was not a televised confession. It was a written appeal delivered through a private channel, asking for one last path back into royal recognition. Royal recognition meant more than a family greeting. It meant being acknowledged again within the formal circle of royal life, where names, roles, invitations, and public standing carry deep meaning. Meghan understood that and understood it too, and that was why the answer had to come with absolute force. And did not rush. She read the plea once, then again, and the silence around her became heavier with every passing second. The princess was never known for soft theater or emotional display. She was trusted because she could separate feeling from duty, and on this day, that strength became the very thing that made the rejection so devastating. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She rested one hand near the sealed response and carried the burden like someone who knew mercy and monarchy had finally reached opposite sides of the same locked door. Meghan received the answer in silence. For a moment, she stared at the words as if they might change if she waited long enough. They did not. The palace had confirmed there would be no reopening, no quiet review, no future talks hidden behind careful language. The response did not speak of forgiveness. It did not mention healing. It gave no hint that time would soften the decision. Meghan's hope faded into disbelief, and the finality of it struck harder because it had been written with such calm control. A senior aide noticed the moment that made everything clear, and did not ask for the file back. She did not request another briefing. She simply said, "Send it." That was all. 2 words, cold enough to end years of uncertainty. And when the statement moved through the palace, everyone understood the truth. This rejection had not begun with Meghan's final plea. It had begun long before with an old wound that nobody inside the royal family had truly forgotten. And before anyone could understand why and became the one to close the door, they had to understand exactly who was standing on each side of it. This was never just about a letter. It was about Meghan's last attempt to be heard, Anne's refusal to bend, Charles's aching silence, and William's cold awareness that one wrong move could reopen every fracture the monarchy had spent years trying to bury. In that private storm, each person carried a different fear, a different memory, and a different reason for wanting the door either opened or sealed forever. Meghan wanted acceptance, but not the kind that could be hidden behind cold manners and polite distance. She wanted recognition, a sign that she had not been erased completely from the royal story. Royal recognition meant being treated as someone still connected to the formal life of the family, even without full duties or public power. Meghan knew the difference. She was not asking to stand at the center again. She was asking not to be left outside forever, and understood the request better than anyone wanted to admit. The princess knew that one small opening could become a storm, and one emotional gesture could become a public demand. Meghan understood Anne's power too, and that made the rejection more painful. If the princess refused, there was no softer figure left to persuade. Anne was the wall behind the wall, the royal voice people trusted when feeling had to be separated from duty. Charles read the briefing alone, and did not speak for a long time. The king carried the pain differently because Meghan was not just a name in a file. She was tied to his son, his grandchildren, and the family wound that had followed him for years. The briefing was a private palace document, meaning a controlled written account prepared for senior royals before a major decision. Charles set it down slowly, torn between a father's regret and a monarch's need to protect the institution from another public collapse. William chose every word before he went near Anne. The prince knew compassion could be twisted into weakness, and weakness could become the crack through which the old drama returned. Catherine's name did not sit at the center of the file, but it moved through the background like a quiet ache. The princess had not demanded revenge. She had not asked for punishment, but her trust had been damaged, and William understood that asking Catherine to accept another risk would carry its own cost. And opened the file, and saw more than Meghan's final plea. She saw a private timeline of warnings, mischances, broken understandings, and moments where the palace had stepped back when it could have struck harder. The princess was not reacting to one message. She was weighing every previous moment that had made this final request feel impossible. The deeper truth was already waiting inside those pages. And did not close the door because of one letter. She closed it because everyone inside the palace remembered the moment when hesitation quietly turned into refusal. Every royal rupture has a moment people later point to and say that was when everything changed. For this story, it was not a televised interview, not a public accusation, not a headline. It was a private Windsor reception behind closed doors where Meghan made one request and gave one warning, and the room felt the temperature drop before anyone dared admit the relationship had crossed a line. Meghan arrived at that meeting believing there was still room for repair. The Windsor reconciliation reception was a private family gathering arranged months earlier to test whether limited royal contact could begin again without public promises or official restoration. Limited contact meant small family access, quiet invitations, and controlled appearances without returning to full royal duties. Meghan understood the offer was careful, but she also believed one visible sign of warmth could change the story overnight. And watched the room with the calm of someone who missed nothing. The princess knew the reception was meant to be symbolic, and that mattered because symbols inside the royal family can quickly become weapons outside it. Meghan moved toward her during a quieter moment and asked for one public gesture at a future family ceremony. A family ceremony meant an official royal occasion where presents, seating, and greetings could send a message without one word being spoken. Meghan wanted that message and knew exactly why. Meghan spoke softly, but the request carried sharp weight. She told, and that one acknowledgement would prove she had not been permanently erased. The princess listened, then answered with a warning that cut through every polite smile in the room. Trust could not be staged for cameras. Meghan's face changed at once. The hope did not vanish completely, but it hardened into something colder, something wounded, something that told, and this was no longer just about healing. Anne did not raise her voice. She did not need to. When Meghan asked whether the palace would publicly correct the impression that she had been shut out forever, the princess gave the answer that later became the true point of no return. Only truth can be corrected. The words were later preserved in a documented account prepared for Charles, and when the king read them, he understood why and had come away changed. Charles learned that the conversation had left and deeply unsettled. The king saw that the princess believed Meghan wanted a symbol before accountability, and that belief became the foundation for everything that followed. Meghan had asked for a door, and had seen a risk, and from that moment, the final plea was already moving toward its rejection. That night did not explode in public. It did something more dangerous. It stayed quiet, waited, and shaped the confrontation everyone inside the palace feared. When Anne finally faced the question directly, there was no crowd, no ceremony, and no room for performance. Meghan's final plea had reached the palace, but before the response was approved, one last private conversation was allowed. It was brief, it was controlled, and it carried the terrible stillness of people who already knew the ending but had to speak the words anyway. Meghan understood the weight of that room before a single answer was given. The private palace sitting room was not a public stage. It was a controlled royal space where sensitive family matters could be discussed away from cameras, aides, and outside pressure. That mattered because this was Meghan's last chance to speak, without headlines twisting every breath. It also mattered because Anne had already read the full file, which meant the princess had not come to be persuaded. She had come to listen once, then decide with final force. The rejection was no longer just Anne's will because something larger had moved behind it, a hidden structure built to stop emotion from dragging the monarchy backward. And once that structure moved into place, even Charles's silence became part of the decision. The palace does not close a door with one person's opinion. It closes it through procedure, pressure, memory, and fear. Behind Anne's rejection stood a quiet chain of authority that had been built to prevent the monarchy from being pulled backward by emotion. Yet at the center of that chain was still one woman sitting with a pen in her hand, knowing her signature would wound someone permanently, and understood why the responsibility had fallen on her. The princess had become the guardian of discipline inside the family, the person trusted when personal feeling threatened royal stability. Royal stability meant keeping the monarchy steady, respected, and protected from choices that could create public chaos. That mattered because Meghan's plea was not just a private request. It carried the power to reopen old arguments, restart old headlines, and force the family back into a storm they had barely survived. Charles allowed the process to move through, and because his own heart was too tangled. The king knew that if he answered as a father, people would accuse him of weakness, and if he answered as a monarch, people would call him cold. A monarch is the reigning head of the royal family and the state, and that role forced Charles to think beyond private pain. He read the final recommendation and pressed his thumb against the paper, tired in a way no crown could hide. Then he placed it aside without changing a word, and signed the rejection with a controlled hand. The princess did not rush the movement. She wrote, paused, and let the silence gather around her. That pause mattered because it proved the decision was not heartless. Firmness did not mean she felt nothing. And knew Meghan would read the answer as rejection, and she knew Harry would feel the blow beside her. But the princess also knew one softer word could be taken as a promise the palace never intended to keep. William was informed before the confirmation moved forward. The prince listened carefully, then gave only a quiet nod. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had expected the ending but still understood the damage it would cause. William knew the private palace rule behind the decision. No renewed access without trust, no public role without loyalty, no family gesture without institutional consent. Institutional consent meant the whole royal system agreeing before any public step was allowed. Anne's signature became more than ink. It became protection. It became a warning. It became the line that stopped emotion from becoming policy. Charles's silence gave the line authority, and William's acceptance gave it future strength. Once the decision left the room, the consequences moved faster than anyone could control. The rejection had been private, but the fallout was about to become painfully visible. When the palace confirmed the door was closed, the words were brief, but the silence that followed was enormous. No long explanation, no emotional appeal, no promise of future review, just a final boundary delivered with chilling calm. For Meghan, the statement did not feel like protocol, it felt like a wall, and for those inside the palace, it felt like the first breath after years of holding back. Meghan sat with the confirmation open in front of her and did not move at first. The palace statement was short by design, a public message released to make an official decision clear without feeding more drama. That mattered because every extra sentence could become another argument, another headline, another demand for explanation. Meghan understood the coldness of that choice. The fewer words they used, the more final the message became. Harry watched her face change before he said anything. He knew this was not just a rejected request, it was the family boundary becoming harder than ever before. A boundary meant the line the palace would not allow anyone to cross, even for emotion, even for history, even for blood. Harry wanted to comfort Meghan, but he also understood the painful truth sitting between them. This was not a misunderstanding waiting to be fixed. This was a decision already sealed. Meghan closed the screen slowly. She had expected resistance, she had expected distance, but she had not expected the complete absence of a second opening. No private note followed, no softer message arrived through another channel, no careful promise suggested that time might change the answer. Meghan had asked for a door, and the palace had replied like a wall that had learned never to crack again. and received confirmation that the statement had gone live, and the princess did not look relieved. She had carried the decision with discipline, but now it belonged to public history. That mattered because private pain can still be protected, but public rejection lives forever. And knew Meghan would feel exposed. She knew Harry would feel wounded. And still, the princess accepted the cost because she believed the alternative would reopen damage the monarchy could not survive. Aides moved quickly through the internal planning notes. They removed pending references to possible reconciliation, quiet family contact, and future symbolic gestures. Internal planning notes meant private working documents used by palace staff to prepare decisions before the public ever sees them. The changes proved the rejection was not symbolic, it was operational. The whole system was now adjusting to the new reality. The silence after the statement became its own kind of thunder. Meghan had the answer, Harry had the consequence, and had the burden, and the palace had its line. Yet the true turning point would not come from the announcement. It would come from a private moment between two people who had no officials left to hide behind. The loudest royal decisions often end in the quietest rooms. After the statement, after the files, after the controlled language had done its work, and Charles were left with the human weight of what had happened. No aides softened the air, no secretary explained the wording. There were only two senior royals, one closed door, and the question neither of them wanted to ask aloud. Charles stood with the burden of the crown pressing harder than any public duty. The crown meant more than a jewel or a title. It meant the power, responsibility, and pressure of protecting the monarchy as an institution. That mattered because the rejection did not only affect Meghan, it touched Harry, the family, the public image of forgiveness, and the king's own painful sense of failure. Charles had allowed the decision to stand, but now he had to live with what that meant. And watched him carefully before either of them spoke. The princess knew her brother was not angry with her. He was wounded by the reality that the monarchy had reached a point where kindness could no longer be simple. Charles finally asked whether there had been any other way. The question was quiet, but it carried years of regret. And looked at him with sadness and answered that there had been many chances, but not anymore. Charles turned away because the answer hurt more than a direct accusation. The king understood that, and had not acted out of cruelty. She had acted because opening the door without trust would punish the people who had stayed loyal, stayed silent, and carried the strain while the family broke in public. Trust meant more than personal forgiveness inside royal life. It meant confidence that private words would stay private and public gestures would not be used as weapons. And admitted through a private recorded conversation prepared for the family record that she had felt no victory in rejecting Meghan. The princess said the door had closed because the monarchy could not keep rewarding damage with access. Charles listened without interrupting. He knew and was speaking not only as a sister, but as the person brave enough to say what others had feared to say aloud. Charles gave a small nod. It was not triumph, it was surrender to final acceptance. The king had hoped somewhere deep inside that time might soften the edges, and had shown him that time had done the opposite. It had made the line clearer. That private acceptance changed the meaning of the entire decision. Meghan had been refused, and had carried the burden. Charles had stopped resisting the truth, and as the palace absorbed that silence, the outside world began turning the rejection into a defining public moment. What had been decided in silence was now being judged in headlines, broadcasts, and crowds beyond the palace gates. By morning, the rejection was no longer a private royal wound. It belonged to the world. Across breakfast tables, television studios, and palace pavements, people argued over whether and had been merciless or necessary. But one image captured the national mood more sharply than any debate, a newspaper front page showing a closed palace gate beneath the headline, "The door is closed." Meghan became the name at the center of every conversation, and became the force behind the decision. Major broadcasters framed the moment as the most definitive royal rejection Meghan had faced since leaving official life, and that mattered because the story was no longer about distance, it was about finality. Official life meant active public royal duty where appearances, titles, and family access are tied to service. Meghan was outside that world now, and the palace had made clear there was no path back through private pleading. Anne's role gave the story its steel. Commentators understood that if the princess had rejected the appeal, the decision carried more than palace caution. It carried discipline, tradition, and the kind of authority people linked to duty over emotion. And was not seen as someone chasing headlines. She was seen as someone who would say no even when no was painful. That made Meghan's rejection feel less like a passing dispute and more like a royal verdict. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, and the debate became personal. Buckingham Palace is the monarch's main working residence in London, and when people stand at its gates, they are not just watching a building. They are reacting to the symbol of the crown itself. Some supported and quietly, saying the family had protected itself at last, while others said Meghan deserved one final act of compassion. One young woman near the gates said families should leave one light on, but an older royal supporter answered, "Not if the house keeps burning." Palace aides watched the public reaction with careful faces. They noticed sympathy was divided, but confusion was not. Everyone understood the message. Meghan had asked for a door, and had refused. Charles had allowed the refusal to stand. The palace had confirmed it without warmth, and that cold wording had done exactly what it was designed to do. The newspaper front page became the image people remembered, a closed palace gate, a black headline, for words that turned a private rejection into a national symbol. The door is closed. Meghan's pain became public, Anne's firmness became history, Charles's silence became part of the verdict. The noise outside faded, but the meaning did not. The world now understood the door was closed, and the final question became what this ending truly meant for Meghan and Charles and the monarchy itself. In the end, Anne's rejection of Meghan's final plea was not just a refusal, it was a verdict. It declared that pain could be heard without being allowed to rewrite the rules. It proved that family feeling, once broken too many times, could no longer override duty, and it marked the moment the monarchy stopped looking backward and chose survival over sentiment. Meghan was left with the pain of final exclusion, and this time there was no softer meaning hidden underneath it. Royal recognition meant being accepted again in the formal life of the family through respect, access, invitations, and public standing. That mattered because Meghan had not asked for an ordinary apology. She had asked for a sign that the life she once stood inside had not fully closed against her. Anne's refusal, backed by the palace confirmation, ended that hope with brutal clarity. Anne carried the burden differently. The princess had become the person who said no, and that kind of strength still leaves a scar. She knew Meghan would feel the decision as rejection, and she knew Harry would carry the wound beside her, and also understood that protection and punishment can look painfully similar from the outside. The monarchy presented the decision as protection because allowing emotion to reopen a broken door could have placed the entire family back inside the same storm. Charles's silence became the deepest revelation of all. The king did not overturn the decision. He did not soften it. He did not send a second message that weakened the first. The crown, meaning the power and duty of the monarchy itself, could no longer afford emotional contradiction. Charles may have felt the private ache of a father, but the monarch in him accepted that mercy, without trust, could become danger. William's quiet acceptance confirmed where the future was going. The prince did not need a dramatic speech to make his position clear. His silence carried the shape of the next chapter. Fewer gestures, firmer boundaries, and no return without absolute trust. William understood that every royal opening now had to be earned, not begged for, and every act of compassion had to protect those who had stayed loyal. Meghan's final plea ended as a line in royal history, but the meaning was larger than one rejection. And closed the door. Charles allowed it to remain closed. William accepted the direction it created, and the palace confirmed what everyone now understood. The monarchy had chosen discipline over reunion, finality over confusion, and survival over one last emotional rescue. There is no door left waiting in the shadows. And closed it. The palace confirmed it, and everyone involved now understands that this chapter has ended for good. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.